Hi and welcome back to the channel. So to properly continue our series of orchestral mockup tricks, let's dive into the Woodwinds section, which in my humble opinion is the most versatile family member of the whole orchestra, but also on the other hand the most underestimated one. That being said, let's jump into the Cubase and let's find out what we can do with the Woodwinds section to make our orchestral mockups sound more realistic. The first trick is all about the breaths, and this is absolutely crucial when we are working with the woodwinds. When we programming woodwinds, we should remember that any wind instrument should breathe. And this pertains not only to the woodwinds itself, but also for other wind instruments such as brass. In practice, it's a good idea to introduce a short break every 2 to 4 bars depending on the tempo and the intensity of the musical phrase. Those breaths don't just make our orchestral mockup and performance sound more realistic, they also help you to underline the musical phrase, especially the end of the musical phrase, making it feel more natural and more intentional. So first, let's listen to a short example without any breaths, and then the same passage with proper breathing space added. Now sometimes in the orchestration that moment of breathing can feel disruptive or simply not desirable in the musical flow. In those cases, a very efficient solution is to introduce a counter melody exactly where the main woodwinds take a breath. This allows you to avoid the empty gap, and at the same time it creates a musical dialogue between main melody and the counter melody, making the orchestration more interesting and expressive. Let's listen to the same passage again, first without counter melody and then with the counter melody added during the breath spaces. So I assume that you can immediately hear that the arrangement feels more fluid and gains the momentum thanks to the counter melody filling that breathing spaces. The second trick is about the tone color. And woodwinds are probably the most colorful family in the whole orchestra. Even though most woodwinds instruments have a relatively limited range, each of them has a very distinct timbre and character. What's even more interesting is that the same instrument can sound completely different depending on the register you are using. Because of that, writing the exact same musical phrase for different woodwinds instruments can result in dramatically different emotional outcomes. For example, a phrase written for flutes and English horn will feel completely different than the same phrase written for bassoons and contrabassoons. This huge variety of tone colors give you a lot of expressive freedom, which is especially important when you are writing for film and games where emotions and storytelling are everything. From my experience nowadays, many hobbyist composers underestimated woodwinds in this range of usage, or even do not use this family because they do not realize how important woodwinds are in the context of sharing and building emotions. Let's listen to a short example. First, we will hear the phrase orchestrated for a higher woodwind, so flutes, piccolo and English horn. Then we will listen to the exact same phrase but orchestrated for lower woodwinds, bassons and contrabassons. You will notice how this simple change of instruments completely transforms the character and emotional weight of the music, even though the musical material itself stays exactly the same. The third trick shows how woodwinds can be used to support and enhance other sections of the orchestra, especially strings. Very often woodwinds are extremely useful when you want to change the color of another instrument, or when a string line, for example a violin melody, struggles to cut through the dense orchestration. First, let's listen to a string ostinato on its own without any woodwinds layer in it. And now let's listen to the same ostinato again, but this time with woodwinds doubling the exact same phrase. As you can hear, with a very simple copy and paste tool, the ostinato suddenly feels much brighter, clearer, without adding any high frequency saturation or using aggressive EQ on the strings. Woodwinds naturally brings the clarity and presence, especially in the upper frequencies. Now let's move on to a different example for supportive role of the woodwinds. This is the example from my last composition. In the first pass, the melody is played only by the first violin, but in the second pass I added flutes and piccolo flutes, doubling the melody. I'm sure that you will notice that without increasing the volume of the violins, their perceived loudness become higher, simply because the flutes add brightness and definition that helps the melody project through the mix properly. The fourth trick is about the voicing, and in the context of woodwinds this is incredibly important. What really matters here is the relationship between the instrument inside the woodwind section. Let me explain what I mean. The exact same melody played in the flute clarinet layout will sound very different than the same played as a flute clarinet, simply because of how the instruments are arranged across the register. For this reason, I want to focus on two very common voicing approach which I use the most: stacked and interlocked. So let's start with the stacked voicing. In stacked voicing, If we look at the register from the top to the bottom, the instruments follow each other in the blocks. For example, flutes in the green here and the clarinets below. So let's listen to a short example of usage of this stock voicing. Now let's look at interlocked voicing. This is the situation where the instruments are interwoven melodically. So instead of grouping them, we alternate them across the register. For example, flute, clarinet, from top to the bottom. So let's listen to the exact same phrase, but this time using interlock voicing. So we can hear that in the first example, it's very easy to identify which parts are played by flutes and which by clarinets. On the other hand, in the second example, the sound becomes more, let's say, homogeneous and harder to separate by ear, which can be exactly what you want depending on the musical context. The fifth trick can be summed up with a small Shakespeare paraphrase: EQ or not EQ. Taking into account everything we talk about today, especially the huge tonal diversity of Woodwinds instruments, my experience tells me that with Woodwinds less is usually more. That's because woodwinds are very easy to damage with too many EQ moves or with cuts and boosts that are simply too aggressive. Each instrument in the woodwinds family has its own natural character, and over-processing can quickly remove exactly what makes it special. So let's look at two quick examples as usually for EQ, a flute and a bassoon. Speaking of the flutes, as you can see, the EQ curve is really simple. I add a high-pass filter, something around 160 Hz. As I said in my previous videos, it depends on the lowest note of your instrument, so listen carefully to the lowest note, and on the basis of the lowest note frequencies, you can add this high-pass filter, and that's really all. You can try to add the boosts between 8 to 10,000 Ks to bring some air, or to bring some breath between 2 and 3,000 Ks, but it's really not necessary, and from my perspective this high-pass filter is more than enough. When we look at the bassoon, the situation is almost the same. So high-pass filter, naturally more to the left, bearing in mind the range of the instrument, so something around 60 Hz. And also, which is different from the flutes, because we have another curve, I like to cut a little bit between 2 and 300 Hz to get rid of the muddiness of bassoon and leave some space for cellos, especially because it's common practice to double the bassoon with the cellos. And for the bassoon and other lower register woodwinds instruments, from my perspective and in my opinion, that should be more than enough. And those were 5 woodwinds tricks which totally changed the way I'm looking on the orchestral mockups. None of these techniques requires new sample library or expensive plugins. They are all about listening, orchestration and making better decisions. If there is one thing I would like to add is that the woodwinds are not the background layer of the orchestra. This section is the most expressive, colorful and versatile section of the whole orchestra, and when used intentionally, they can bring any mockup to life. If you found the video helpful, feel free to leave a like, and also make sure to let me down in the comments which of the tricks make the biggest difference for you. Cubase files together with the MIDI files will be available on my Buy Me a Coffee channel, so make sure to grab it here. Thanks for watching, and as always, happy composing!